We are mortgaging the future of Canada, and we are mortgaging the future of Canada's youth. So it's not a logical outcome that we continue along this line of deep integration. Far from unprecedented prosperity, we are actually seeing unprecedented misery and an unprecedented fall in income for over most of the levels of the Canadian population. So let's move to the SPP. Started back in 2005. It's important to note that this is a Liberal agenda put in place by a Liberal government, and Stephen Harper is simply implementing the various aspects of what was put in place by the Paul Martin government. The explanation that was given at the time was that this would give even more prosperity to the Canadian population. Well, we can certainly put the lie to that. Jack Layton was the first parliamentarian to intervene on the SPP issue. Even on the eve of that first summit, he said that he was opposed, the NDP was opposed, and it would be fighting tooth and nail to stop this SPP agenda. I'll come back to that in a moment. So what I'd like to give you tonight is the 10 reasons why the NDP is opposing this agenda, far beyond the economic reasons that I've just given you. And there are 10 compelling reasons why we are fighting to stop the SPP. Reason number 1, it is anti-democratic by nature, by its very structure. The Canadian Council of Chief Executives came before the Standing Committee on International Trade in the only parliamentary hearings that have been held so far on the SPP. I'll come back to that in just a moment. And what they said was chillingly honest. They said the SPP was being done behind closed doors, away from parliamentary scrutiny, away from any sort of parliamentary vote, because, quote, the Canadian public was not ready for the agenda, unquote. We're not ready for that kind of bruising battle. Now, let's take back to 1988, when there was an election, a federal election on the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. Most Canadians voted either for the NDP, strongly opposed, or the Liberal Party, was opposed. But because of the vagaries of our electoral system, Brian Mulroney was elected, and the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement was implemented. Fast forward to 1993, and NAFTA had the same type of opposition. The Liberal government under Jean Chrétien, then candidate for Prime Minister, promised that he would not implement the NAFTA agreement. Most people voted either for the Liberals or for the NDP, both opposed. And again, the Liberals went back on their promise and they implemented NAFTA. So the Canadian Council of Chief Executives has a bizarre, but perhaps chillingly honest reason for saying that given that most Canadians rejected the original agenda back in 1988, rejected the NAFTA agenda in 1993, as we can see, most Canadians are worse off now than they were then. If this was brought to the public, most Canadians would resoundingly reject this agenda. So it is anti-democratic by design. Reason number 2, it is surrounded in profound secrecy. Since the very beginning, the NDP has been endeavoring to find out about the discussions that take place behind closed doors in the 19 working groups that have been set up under the SPP, negotiating away from public scrutiny. And we have been successful after months and months of fighting, appeals to the Information Commissioner, fighting through the various bureaucracies to have hundreds and hundreds of pages of documentation on the SPP released. And I'd like to share some of those pages with you tonight. Here's one page that you can see has been completely censored by the federal government. Here's another page that I'll provide to you, similar. You can see that there's a heading, it's an email regarding the SPP, completely censored. The hundreds of pages that we've managed to have released have been heavily censored by the federal government. And that is the second reason why we're opposing this agenda, is that the government is refusing to divulge in any way the kinds of negotiations that are taking place behind closed doors. Reason 3, it is about much more than jelly beans. You may recall the Montebello Summit, Stephen Harper said, well, you don't have to worry about the SPP agenda. It's simply about standardizing the jelly bean. It's simply about harmonization of candy regulations. But the documentation that we have seen, that we've received, that hasn't been censored, points from, in the government's own words, to a deep and wide-ranging agenda, covering over 300 different regulatory areas, including such profound areas as how we treat chemicals in the environment. It is about much, much more than jelly beans. Reason number 4, it is about quality of life issues, transportation safety, the approval of drugs in Canada, the food safety, food that we consume. Last spring, the Ottawa Citizen revealed that the Harper government was pushing to allow more pesticides in Canadian food, that essentially what they were trying to do was lower our standards in food safety to lower American standards. Now, the idea of having more pesticides in Canadian food is a bad idea for 2 reasons. First off, for producers who've been held to a higher standard, they will now be competing with a lower standard of food coming into Canada. But secondly, and most importantly, for Canadian consumers of these food products. We know that increased consumption of pesticides is linked to such diseases as Parkinson's disease. So allowing more pesticides in Canadian food puts safety, health and safety of Canadians at risk.